Dr. Greer, Dr. Greer, are you prepared with your opening statement? Are you prepared with your opening statement? All right. Well, the chair recognizes Dr. Greer for 5 minutes for the purposes of the opening statement.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Linda Greer, and I'm the Director of the Health Program at NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. I have a PhD in environmental toxicology and a master's degree in public health. Since 1981, I have worked on a wide range of environmental health issues and have focused on numerous persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic chemicals, including mercury, dioxin, and PCBs, among others. Common sense tells us that chemicals with a PBT profile are bad actors, and that laws designed to protect people from dangerous environmental contaminants should prioritize the phase-out of chemicals with this alarming profile. Society should rely upon safer chemicals that will degrade and be metabolized easily in the body back into harmless chemicals after use, not those that will take shelter in our bones, in our blood, and in our fat for the rest of eternity. Remarkably, however, PBTs are not a thing of the past. Despite the notoriety of this class and all that scientists have learned about them over the past 30 years, there are still many such chemicals that continue to be used in commerce today, and sometimes in very large quantities. 3 of EPA's 4 recently announced chemical action plans, for example, are from the PBT class. The polybrominated diphenyl ethers, the PBDEs, are still used today as flame retardants in plastics, polyurethane foams, and textiles, even though safer alternatives are available. They remain in products in millions of homes. This, despite the evidence that their chemical structure is extraordinarily similar to the PCBs banned decades ago, that they share structural characteristics of the dioxins. Despite the toxicological evidence that shows that PBDEs are thyroid hormone disruptors, that they are neurotoxic to the developing brain, and that they have immunotoxic properties similar to PCBs. Despite the doubling of their concentrations in breast mix samples every 5 years. Despite their detection globally, including in the Arctic where they have never been used, PBDEs are still in use in 2010. And other PBDEs are similarly still in the market and used in high volume, despite all that we know about the hazard they pose, defying common sense. So how can this be? It is truly a tribute to the utter impotence of Tosca that chemicals with such notorious profiles remain on the market, allowing the public to be endlessly exposed while analysis after analysis lumbers on. Tosca constraints make it very difficult for EPA to fully assess new chemicals or require the testing of chemicals in use. And the hurdles for EPA to actually restrict use of an existing chemical are even higher. It is almost impossible for EPA to take regulatory action against PBTs and other dangerous chemicals, even those like asbestos that are well known to cause cancer or other serious health effects. And although some in industry see the problems and agree that we need reform, many others are comfortable with the culture of study and delay that has kept EPA from taking action on chemicals they have marketed without safety data for more than a generation. This head-in-the-sand mentality is not good for business in the long run. Europe is far ahead of us and will prohibit the export of these chemicals to their markets. Safety problems will plague these companies eventually, as the latest story from Toyota shows us. The consequence of such delay in getting PBTs and other dangerous chemicals off the market may well have had a personal impact on me. 3 years ago, as I continued my career to reduce toxic chemical pollution, I got a call from my doctor about an abnormality in my mammogram. Soon afterwards, I was struggling to come to terms with the diagnosis every woman dreads, breast cancer. Despite my PhD, I found myself thinking what everyone thinks in a situation like this: why did this happen to me? And not just why me, but why so many colleagues and friends. The president of NRDC, Frances Beinecke, was diagnosed with breast cancer about 8 years ago. So was the executive assistant of John Adams, our former president. She died of that disease before the age of 45. A woman in our finance department, another in communications, one of our senior analysts, an office manager, a young temporary secretary, my sister-in-law. Most or all of these women did not have known risk factors, and all of them contracted this disease when they were very young. I suspect many of the members of this committee and their staff have had similar experiences. Friends, family, and colleagues who have been diagnosed with cancer, or who have children with infertility issues, or grandchildren with developmental or learning disabilities, or elderly parents with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. I tell my story to inspire you, this committee, this Congress, and this administration to seriously consider what it will take to get action on hazardous chemicals still being used in commerce today, known PBTs and others. Not just testing, not just information, not more analysis, action. Well-known PBTs such as dioxin, DDT, and PCBs have been associated with the risks of breast cancer for many, many years. A survey of peer-reviewed literature found more than 200 chemicals have been associated with mammary tumors in animals, chlorinated solvents, polynuclear atomerics, and others. Yet EPA has taken action on only 4 of 80,000 chemicals in commerce in the 35 years of Tosca. The public is rightfully alarmed and wants to see action and results, not just more years of studies that lead nowhere. Many retailers have themselves taken action to remove products from shelves where they fear harm to their customers in light of government stagnation. Even certain segments of industry itself, the personal products manufacturers, for example, who manufacture our lotions and shampoos, have begun to speak out for the need for reform, fearing problems in the ingredients that they buy for their formulation. For this reason, we recommend Congress and this committee mandate the phase-out of at least the handful of best-known PDPs and bad actors in a reauthorized Tosca, and put our country on a path forward for the use of safer chemicals. We have spent literally decades quantifying the risks of these chemicals and exposed an entire generation in the meantime, unable to turn to the more practical questions of how these PBTs are used, how they can be reduced, how they can be phased out. It's time for EPA to parse the uses, identify the critical uses, identify the unnecessary uses, and move forward on these chemicals. I was one of the lucky ones. My breast cancer has been caught early, and I'm doing well. But as I do my work every day, I think of my daughter, who is dosed with every contaminant in my breast milk 4 or more times a day for the first year of her life and of her generation. My efforts here today and back at the desk to reduce or eliminate toxic chemicals are for her, and you too should take action to protect your children and grandchildren. Thank you very much for this opportunity to testify.
The chair now recognizes Dr. Corn Ellsbury.
First, I
5 minutes.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank the chairman and the ranking member and the members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify before you today. My name is Christina Cowan-Ellsbury, and I have worked in the field of environmental and human safety and risk assessment of chemicals for over 30 years. I am here of my own volition and represent only myself. My testimony is based on my scientific training and expertise and my experience with the PBT issue. There are 2 reasons I decided to come on my own. First, as a consumer and citizen of the United States, I am as concerned as you are about chemicals that may be in commerce and that could cause adverse impacts on me, my family, and the environment. Secondly, I have worked since the 1990s and actually earlier on the development of the PBT criteria and methods for identifying and evaluating the safety of organic PBTs in several national and international fora, including the United States, Canada, Europe, and the United Nations. I have seen how using the established criteria and science and risk-based assessment process has resulted in effective PBT identification and assessment programs and has resulted in prioritization of resources toward PBT management on national and global scales. As successful as these initiatives have been in illustrating that it is possible to identify, assess, and manage PBTs, these initiatives have also illustrated that the process can be scientifically challenging and require the active involvement of the best scientists and the use of the most reliable and relevant data. At the recent CTAC-Pelston workshop, one common frustration voiced by participants was that many of the current national and international regulations accept only a limited set of test data. While this may be appropriate for screening and prioritization, it fails to recognize the incredible evolution of the science, which has produced new insights into PBT chemicals and an array of new methods to identify and assess PBT chemicals. As a result, the scientists are frustrated when they bring forward these new data and insights only to find that they're rejected, not because of scientific reasons, but rather because the regulatory framework does not allow for its consideration. Given the rapid improvement in these test methods and guidance, it is critically important for U.S. EPA scientists to contribute to and incorporate the most current science and scientific understanding into their assessments. Through all my years of work on PBTs, I have greatly valued the scientific expertise and interaction with my colleagues in the U.S. EPA and commend them for their role in promoting the risk-based and science-based underpinnings of the PBT identification and assessment process. My concern is, and is voiced by several here, is that although the U.S. publicly committed in the 1990s to working within the international community to address chemicals of international concern, the U.S. has not become a full party to either the LURTAC POPs protocol or the Stockholm POPs protocol. Unfortunately, the risk-based and science-based underpinning of these two conventions, which the United States promoted, are being eroded without this active U.S. involvement. I strongly urge you to make sure that the U.S. becomes a full party to these conventions so that the U.S. government scientists can once again bring their knowledge and expertise forward in leadership internationally. Finally, I believe it is also important that EPA develop a stronger federal PBT program so that the states do not have to take separate and potentially conflicting actions to identify and manage these substances. Many states don't have the depth of scientific expertise nor the number of staff to effectively conduct these scientifically challenging assessments on their own. To ensure a technically strong and coordinated process for identification, assessment, and management of PBTs, this program should include a scientific multi-stakeholder fora that includes representatives from these states, as well as potentially other scientific advisory panel members. Ultimately, I believe that a reform of TSCA that contains a strong commitment to and adequate funding for this federal program of PBT identification, assessment, and management, and U.S. leadership internationally in PBT conventions will benefit U.S. citizens, as it will contribute to improving global public health and the environment through managing existing PBT chemicals and provide assurance that new chemicals that have PBT properties will not enter commerce. Once again, I thank you for this opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Sturdivant for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, for holding this hearing and for having me. My name is Ted Sturdivant. I am the director of the Washington State Department of Ecology. Citizens in Washington State, like elsewhere I imagine, expect from government basic health protections from things like toxic exposures. In recent years, we in Washington were seeing rising levels of concern around toxic chemicals, and so a few years ago we made an agency priority the reduction of toxic threats in our state. And we started with starting the nation's first PBT program. That seemed like a very logical place to start for reasons that you've heard. It's very clear that we should be very careful with PBTs, and it's also very clear that we're not very careful with PBTs. I had a real aha moment when we were writing our PBT regulation. I was at home one morning shaving, and I looked at the ingredients in the shaving cream, and nonylphenol was on there. And the only reason that I knew what the heck that was is that we were considering inclusion of that chemical in our PBT list. It was right on the bubble. And nothing on the can indicated it was anything I should be worried about. And it just, and I was rubbing this stuff on my face every day. And it just left me with this sense that no one was really watching, and certainly not watching as closely as we should be. I think that only prevention works with PBTs. Once you let the PBT genie out of the bottle, you can't get it back in. PCBs are a great example of that. They were banned 34 years ago, but today PCBs are flowing into Puget Sound all the time. We're spending millions of dollars on cleanup, and we're still seeing fish and wildlife impacts from PCBs. A good and more recent example of both the challenge and I think the solution is found in the PBDE flame retardants you've heard about. They've been around since the 70s. In 2003, we were seeing rising levels of PBDEs in Washington's environment and citizens. We didn't really know much about them. They were appearing in women's breast milk, in house dust that babies crawl around in polar bears in the Arctic. So we decided to take a look at them as part of our PBT program. We spent 3 years working on a chemical action plan for those flame retardants, and the more we looked, the more concerned we grew. Levels kept rising. Studies kept showing more health concerns. In the meanwhile, industry was applying pressure, saying they're safe, that we need to protect fire safety standards, we need to keep studying them, and basically that everything was fine. But we reached a very different conclusion. We decided that if there were better ways, if there were safer ways to flame retard products in our homes, like TVs, computers, mattresses, furniture, then we should stop using PBDEs and use those safer alternatives. And we found ourselves in the middle of quite a fight. Some very sophisticated folks showed up in Olympia and fought us pretty hard on that. And it took a while, but we did finally get there, and we passed the nation's first ban on the DECA form of PBDEs. But that was only one state. The other states, several other states, had to then go through the same fight, take different approaches. And the good news is that enough states did that there was a recent announcement of a voluntary phase-out of DECA production in the United States. The bad news is that that's not a very good system. It takes too long, it costs too much, it creates this patchwork of regulatory approaches across the country, and it lets far too much unnecessary toxic contamination happen in the meantime. You know, I don't think at the root of this that the problem or the solution is terribly complicated. We need a federal system that works based on a few common sense principles. First, before allowing a substance to be put out there into widespread commerce, we should make every reasonable effort to make sure that it's safe. I think that it's fair that that burden rests on industry rather than on EPA and the taxpayers. Second, if we know that there are chemicals out there that are causing environmental or human health problems, government should be able to step in, protect citizens, and ban those chemicals. Third, if we know with reasonable certainty that a substance poses problems and there are safer alternatives, we should stop using that and switch to the safer alternative. With PBTs, I think we already know enough that we should be very careful and make every effort to phase out those uses that we can do without and prevent new uses. These seem to me to be sound, fair principles for a reasonable chemicals policy, but it's not the one we have today. I would urge you to fashion such a policy. This isn't about being anti-chemical, it's about being pro-safer chemical whenever you can and should. As you look at Tosca, I would ask you to keep in mind the role that the states have played in advancing protections from PBTs and other toxic chemicals. Even with Tosca reform, if another 30 years go by before we revisit it, we're going to need the states to fill in the gaps and be the laboratories of reform, and I would ask you to preserve our ability to do that. And because we at the state level need a strong federal system, Washington and 12 other states in December issued our principles for reform of Tosca, and those were provided to you with my written testimony. Finally, one other priority that we have in the state of Washington is restoring our Puget Sound to health by 2020. That problem with the sound is not just about toxic pollution, but toxic chemicals are entering the sound every day. Now, fixing Tosca won't fix Puget Sound. But if we don't fix Tosca and prevent a lot of that toxic contamination that could be prevented, we're not going to fix Puget Sound, and I don't think we're going to fix a lot of our other waterways either. And we'll continue to experience toxic exposures that just don't need to happen. So with that, I would like to express my very sincere gratitude for your looking at this issue, and I respectfully urge you to craft a strong chemicals management policy that this country very much needs and deserves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the chair recognizes Dr. Adams for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my pleasure this morning to testify and talk about Toxic Substance Control Act and PBT, particularly as it applies to metals. I am the chairman of the North American Metals Council. I'm also a scientist, and I have worked in the area of PBT since the late 70s, and specifically in the 1990s, and more recently on the REACH legislation in Europe. And over the course of time, I've published some 100 papers, and I have published a book on PBT. So let me begin. I would like to give you some details about why PBT, some of the criteria of PBT are not applicable to metals. I would also like to give you some information on how as to how I think the hazard of metals and inorganic substances should be determined. Regarding persistence, persistence is problematic for metals because all metals and elements on the periodic table are conserved and hence they are persistent. The form and availability of the metal can change depending on the environmental conditions. They are also different for each metal element on the periodic table, and this should be considered. Thus, setting a criterion, say, of example of removal of 70% in 28 days in the water, automatically includes all the metals, and this includes the ones that are essential, such as copper, zinc, and iron, which are essential for life. As a result, applying criteria that were designed for organic substances to the metals then creates problems that are not necessarily needed. Regarding bioaccumulation, unlike organic substances, bioaccumulation potential of metals cannot be estimated using octanol water partition coefficients. This is a common approach to estimate the amount of substance will accumulate in the fat of an organism. Bioconcentration and bioaccumulation factors are inversely related to exposure for metals. This is not the case for organics. The consequence of this is that in the most cleanest environments we have, let's take Lake Superior, what we find in that situation is that we have the biggest bioaccumulation factors. PBT criteria use, for example, use a bioaccumulation factor of 1,000 to decide whether a substance is bioaccumulative. All the metals pass that criteria for Lake Superior. So, in fact, the whole approach is counterintuitive. The cleanest environments give you the biggest bioconcentration factors. In short, that B does not work for inorganic substances. Regarding toxicity, metals are generally not soluble. Toxicity results are almost always based on the soluble metal salt that has been used in some toxicity tests for some organism. However, those are not the products that are put in the marketplace. By and large, the massive metals, the powders, the oxides, the sulfides are insoluble substances. I would like to point out in our recent discussions with the European Commission, we had the same discussion, and after a long period of time and many testimonies, the REACH regulations now acknowledge that PBT criteria do not apply to metals, and you can find this in the text of the Annex 13 of the REACH regulation. Now, I would like to take a moment or two then to propose an alternative. If we argue that P and B are not applicable to metals, then let's look at what I think might work. In 2003, I chaired a CTAC, Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry workshop. We invited some 40 scientists from around the world to participate in this, and the specific issue at hand was how do we assess the hazard of metals? At this workshop, PBT issues were discussed at length and reported out in a book which I edited. Consensus was reached at the workshop that the individual criteria P, B, and T are limited in their ability to assess hazard or to prioritize metal substances. The criteria are not linked or integrated, and they attempt to identify or predict hazards using bioaccumulation and persistence as modifiers of toxicity, but without fully incorporating other important fate characteristics, which for metals can include speciation, complexation, precipitation, dissolution, transformation, and sedimentation. And the approach does not consider exposure or release rate. So we are essentially assessing hazard, but no effort to assess risk. The science group recommended that a more comprehensive approach be taken for both metals and organics, in which a generic hazard ranking could be determined using a model which simulates natural receiving water such as a lake. The model is termed a unit world model. The aim is to incorporate partitioning, transport, reactivity, bioavailability, and exposure route to give a single transparent metric of hazard. It is essentially a critical load approach in which an estimate is made at the rate at which a chemical must be introduced into a common defined environment to achieve a concentration that becomes toxic. Hazardous substance, and the output of this model then is a calculation of the rate and the amount that has to be released to cause a problem. This allows then a ranking of both metals and organic substances, so that you now not only just have a criteria that says yes, it's PBT, but you have a ranking of the substances. Following the workshop, efforts have been ongoing to develop and validate this model, and we worked on this now for 6 years. This model is now available, and it's can be downloaded, and you can find it at www.unitworldmodel.net. In conclusion, attempts to universally and indiscriminately apply PBT criteria to all chemical substances, for example, including metals, would be of concern and would not necessarily reflect good science. Similarly, PBT information by itself cannot determine risk, and such criteria should not be used in isolation as a basis for requiring regulatory action. It is important, and I summarize, to understand that persistence and bioaccumulation factors are not particularly useful for assessing metals. I believe the state of the science has moved beyond PBT, and we have an opportunity to use more integrated and a more reliable approach that not only considers the hazard, but also considers release rates and processes that occur in nature. And this approach is now available. I thank you for this opportunity, and I'd be pleased to take any questions.
The chair thanks the witnesses again, and the chair recognizes himself now for 5 minutes of questioning of the witnesses. And Dr. Greer, it is my understanding that if we know a given chemical is toxic and there is exposure, then we can determine the risk. As defined by the National Academies in their 1983 so-called Red Book that is laid out the federal risk assessment process. Risk assessment is, quote, the characterization of the potential adverse health effects of human exposures to environmental hazards. From that, Dr. Greer, can we assume that if a chemical is persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, that it is a PBT and that there is known exposure, so therefore there is a high risk? I have a couple other questions that go along with that. When we know that there are PBTs with evidence of exposure, I understand that exposure can be disproportionate based on geographic areas of specific populations. How should we address this concern? Would you answer both of those questions?
Sure. Let me clarify that it's not my position that risk assessment is not a valuable tool or that it's not important to look at both hazard and exposure, not at all. But there are certain chemicals out there that meet the PBT criteria for which we already have evidence of exposure through biomonitoring of human blood or through looking at animals at the top of the food chain. And that combination, in my mind, is definitely sufficient to identify those chemicals for fast action so that the agency does not spend years and years deciding what level is dangerous, but starts asking questions about use reduction instead. Do we have critical uses that we have to keep on the market? Do we have really the opposite, stupid uses that we could get rid of quickly, and to start asking reduction questions rather than risk questions. So I think that the real problem here is not so much the debate about risk assessment and exposure, but really how to change Tosca so that it's not just about study, but is about taking action instead, asking the set of use reduction questions and exposure reduction questions instead of the questions just about hazard, which is what the agency has unfortunately spent most of its 35 years doing. And when we look at the uses of these chemicals, we have to look at the patterns of exposure and the patterns of use. We know from experience that there are many communities with hotspots of exposure where certain chemicals have been used in large quantities and have accumulated, certain patterns in diets that have led to hotspots of human exposure, et cetera. It's very hard to make a general safety determination that it's going to be okay here and not okay there because we usually lack the information about the widespread and spotty uses of these chemicals combined. Hope that answers your two questions.
Dr. Jones, I have about another minute and a half. You care to use the balance of my time to respond to the questions? Yes.
The agency believes that ultimately we need to evaluate chemicals based on their hazard, their exposure, and their risk. And the reason for that is that by addressing chemicals and uses that have the highest risk, we're going to get the best protection for the country, and not spending our energies on exposure routes that may pose little or no risk, but instead on those exposure routes that are going to present the highest risk.
Okay. the chair recognizes now Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. We appreciate it very much. Mr. Jones, back in 1991, there was a lawsuit, Corrosion-Proof Fittings versus EPA, which evidently in the Tosca Act, when you came up with a measure to correct a problem, you had to use the least burdensome standard. And evidently in that particular case, EPA did not use the least burdensome standard. What is the difference in the standards in this in Tosca and in, say, the Clean Air Act?
Unfortunately, I'm not particularly expert at the Clean Air Act, but I have a high degree of expertise in the pesticide regulatory framework, FIFRA and FSCA.
Say RCRA. Okay, let's say RCRA.
Well, I'm sorry. My expertise is in pesticides and in Tosca.
Okay.
The pesticides program, which is sort of similar, it's chemicals.
Yeah.
The standard is a reasonable certainty of no harm for chemicals used on food, and it's a basic risk-benefit standard for chemicals that are not used on food. There isn't a least burdensome requirement in those statutes.
Okay. Well, under Tosca, when we talk about unreasonable risk, how do you define unreasonable risk? How do you determine something has unreasonable risk?
Unreasonable risk under Tosca as it exists right now has been interpreted to be a risk-benefit standard, and that so if the risk of the use outweighs the benefits, it's determined to be an unreasonable risk.
Okay. So it is a risk versus benefit. Now, and that is not always the standard in some other environmental laws, is it?
That's correct.
Okay. And I would assume that Dr. Greer and Mr. Sturdivant and maybe Dr. Thompson would agree that the more stringent standard would be the best standard. Would I be correct in that?
I would agree that the track record shows that this standard has not been good for us.
Okay.
For example, in the case that you cite, it had kept the agency from taking action against asbestos, which I think is widely regarded as a dangerous carcinogen.
Yeah.
It's not to say, though, that we don't think that there are critical uses of toxic chemicals that will need to remain on the market.
Right.
And so, there needs to be an exit ramp for those uses so that we don't jam ourselves into something unreasonable in the common language, not in the legal language.
Well, and I think we all agree on that. I mean, hopefully that there are chemicals that are quite valuable, and yet there is some dangers to most chemicals, and hopefully we could, when we rewrite this act, can come up with a balanced approach that would benefit everyone. Another question I had for you, maybe Mr. Jones or anyone else that wants to talk about it, the Toxic Release Inventory Program, which I guess came about because of the Community Right to Know Act. And it's my understanding that EPA in the Toxic Release Inventory Program right now has something like 600 and some chemicals that are on that list. How were those chemicals selected?
Largely based on their toxicity, although there is a special way in which PBTs can be identified, and they actually have a lower reporting threshold than chemicals that are not PBTs.
Yeah. And who actually makes that decision?
They're made by the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, and over the last 15 years, at multiple points in time, different administrators have made that determination.
But you have some lab somewhere doing testing on animals to decide. Is that correct?
There is a wide range of toxicity information and sources of information. Some of it is generated by manufacturers, some of it is generated by universities, and some of it is generated in EPA laboratories.
Well, I'm no expert in this, but last night I was sitting around, I was looking at this inventory list, and I just looked down this list of 600 chemicals, and I came across one called Metaram, M-E-T-I-R-A-M, which maybe you all are familiar with, but I wasn't. And it's on the list of Community's Right to Know. And yet when I read the toxicity part of the study, it says when rats were fed 1,000 milligrams diet of Miatram for 2 weeks, 5 days per week, no symptoms of illness were produced. No ill effect was observed in dogs that received 45 milligrams daily of this fungicide for 90 days, or 7.5 milligrams daily for almost 2 years. There were no negative effects. So I was just curious, how is it determined that this would be on the list of something that communities need to know about?
I would need to go back and get some more information around that. I know Metaram is a registered pesticide active ingredient, so there would be a wide number of toxicity studies that have been generated to support its registration, so I should be able to answer that question.
Yeah. Well, do any of, Dr. Greer, do you have any comment about that, or you, Mr. Sturdivant? I mean, like I said, I'm not a scientist, but it seems to me that if you give this particular substance, most of the decisions are made based on the animal studies. It's my understanding. And if you give animals that much, and yet you decide to put it on there, I'm just wondering, what is the real standard for deciding? What is the precise standard to make that decision?
I also don't happen to know about that chemical, but like Mr. Jones, I mean, I know the criteria that the agency uses to get those chemicals on the list. So there's something here that doesn't meet the eye. And I would have to go back and then submit for the record what I think is the rationale for having that chemical on the toxic release inventory.
Yeah. Well, is there, if you were at a Rotary Club in your hometown and you were explaining the criteria for placing a chemical on this inventory list, how would you, in layman's term, explain it to them?
Would you like me to?
Yeah.
In layman's terms, I would say they are chemicals that can harm human health or the environment.
They can. Now, that's pretty vague, it would seem, but that's what you would say. Is that correct? Okay, I'm sorry.
I want to recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Dr. Greer, for your answer just saying, because I'm actually speaking to a Rotary Club this evening. If I get any question like that,
I'll come up with a second verb for you.
Yeah, I'll know what to say. I wanted to go right to this discussion you've been having about sort of rapid action versus study, because I imagine that'll be an important part of our discussion on the reauthorization, and will probably lead to some tension of perspectives as well. What do you have in mind when you talk about rapid action, and maybe you could speak to a category of chemicals that we could view as already having been sort of research tested and understood ad nauseum in terms of the toxic impact they have, using whatever combination of standards is appropriate, that we could really just get moving on in terms of this rapid action. So talk about the category and even some of the particular chemicals that you would identify for that rapid action, and then what the rapid action would be that you envision.
Well, in our opinion, there are several dozen chemicals, maybe 2 or 3 dozen chemicals, not hundreds or thousands of chemicals, but a relatively speaking handful of chemicals that have been extremely well studied. They have been studied, many of these chemicals, literally for decades. In the case of a chemical like dioxin, there are file cabinet rooms full of studies on these chemicals. It's not most chemicals, Mr. Sarbanes. I mean, most chemicals, we don't have that amount of study. And so there are really two categories in my mind. The ones that have been extremely well studied, I would put a chemical like TCE on that, a chemical like formaldehyde on that. That we have quite a bit of information. And then the second category would be some of the PBTs. Some of the chemicals that we have known for eras are as one of the other testifiers said, you know, the genie is out of the bottle when they have come out, and we're now in a legacy mode of trying to do the cleanup. And for those two categories of chemicals, I would submit that we really don't need more study. What we really need is an action plan to look at what the uses are and to phase out or reduce the uses and exposures to those chemicals. Because one more study is not going to make the difference. And we already have enough evidence to know that at certain concentrations they will cause problems. So those would be the relative minority of chemicals, relatively short list, but ones that I think are very ripe for action given how long they have been already studied.
Would you imagine identifying those explicitly in a reauthorized statute?
Based on my experience of watching EPA over the years, we learned in other statutes that when we made lists of chemicals, it led to much faster action because the agency took a much longer time left to their own devices to do it. So based on experience with implementation, really, I would strongly recommend that we put the list into the statute, yes.
When you look internationally at some of these other conventions and protocols and regulatory regimes that exist, do you see that approach in place?
Yes, that's right. When you look, for example, at the Stockholm Treaty, at the POX Treaty, those chemicals were named and continue to be named in an ongoing process of adding more chemicals to the list.
And then, Mr. Sturdivant, I was just intrigued by the approach you took. What was the pushback you were getting? You described various parties showing up in the state capitol. Describe a little bit why they were so resistant and where they are now, in that you've taken steps. I mean, it doesn't appear that the economy of Washington State has collapsed due to the measures you've taken. So maybe you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, in fact, when we identified an alternative to this flame retardant, and some of the same companies that made the PBDE flame retardants also made the alternative. So there wasn't anything really in terms of an economic impact, in terms of jobs. Wasn't any impact in terms of flame retardants. It was very interesting, and it felt a little bit like a David and Goliath fight, really, with the resources that came to bear, very sophisticated resources there. And as the evidence continued to sort of go our way, the arguments changed, and in the end, there was an attempt to put a deal together where, okay, so if we're going to go ahead and take action on PBDEs, let's exchange that for greater fire safety standards in the state on other products, basically sort of driving a new market. So, I think that it was about money, and it was about also, I think, setting a precedent. That it was a hard fight because it was the first ban on that product in the country, and others followed, and it was all about whether that first domino was going to topple or not.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask each one of you to respond. We're going to take an additional 3 minutes for additional questions. As we proceed, we know that the great gulf that we're going to have to cross with the Tosca reauthorization is the gulf of banned chemicals or none or not, either abandon them or come up with another process of identifying them, but not with a ban in the legislation. And I'd like to get your response. First of all, do you think that the chemicals should be banned in the legislation? There should be a list of chemicals explicitly banned in the legislation. And if you would take a moment or two to support your answer with your rationale. And I'll start with Mr. Jones.
Well, the agency and the administration has articulated a number of principles. There are 5 principles in all. The first principle is that chemicals should be reviewed against a safety standard that are based on sound science and reflect risk-based criteria protective of human health and the environment. That's probably the principle that most is relevant to the question of should the statute itself ban chemicals. If it's done in a risk-based manner, I think that might be consistent with the principle. If it's just it just names them and bans them without any risk-based criteria related to that, it would seem to be inconsistent with that principle.
Dr. Thompson, can you address that?
I think I'd just echo those comments and just I'd note that internationally, under the Stockholm Convention, we do have a scientific review committee that really looks, at these issues very closely, analyzes it, looks at the risks associated with the chemicals, and they come forward with recommendations to the countries that participate in the agreements in terms of whether a chemical should in fact be banned or should it be restricted in some way and whether exemptions should exist. So just to echo the comments from my colleague from EPA and note that I do think there's sort of a very similar type of a procedure that we have internationally to actualize quite a similar outcome, I think. Thank you.
Sturdivant.
I certainly don't have the expertise to say what chemicals should be on that early action list, but I would say that you need to look at a couple things. One is, so how bad is it? And if it's bad enough, then I think bans are justified. The other question is, are there alternatives? And as Dr. Greer said, is that use really important or necessary? So I think you have to look at both what it's providing and are there alternatives. And if there are alternatives that are easily available, then I think it makes that decision a lot easier to make.
Dr. Greer.
And I'll be quick since I've sort of already answered this question. I do think that there are a number of chemicals that have a mature docket, so to speak, a toxicity docket that is quite complete, and that statutory list would be helpful to get fast action on those chemicals as we reauthorize Tosca.
Dr. Cohen, Ellsbury.
When I worked within the UN on the protocol, that was one of the things that we did emphasize, is that it needed to be risk-based, and I think I would also emphasize that any alternatives also need to be assessed because we don't want to move in precipitously into something that could be worse. And having multiple management options and phasing them in, as Dr. Greer said, getting rid of alternatives where they're maybe not necessary would probably be an easy way to go.
Dr. Adamson.
Yes, thank you. Let me draw upon the experience that's currently in progress in Europe at the moment under the REACH legislation. Under that process, chemicals such as Dr. Greer has mentioned, the ones that are well known, have been identified and put on a list for further review, not further study. The point being is that the studies are done, they've looked at the toxicology, they've determined them to be hazardous and potentially causing risk. But there is then a careful review of the use of the substance, its release to the environment, and the cost benefit. So I would favor rather that kind of approach rather than just prescriptively writing substances into the legislation.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Whitfield for 3 minutes.
Now, I would ask Dr. Greer, what do you say to what Dr. Adams just said there? Do you agree with him or not?
I think, well, it's interesting. I think that what the question really comes down to who's in the best position to make some of those evaluations and decisions. Are there some chemicals that the Congress can take a look at and in discussion with affected parties and with EPA say, okay, this is the list, this is the chemicals. I think that we can do that, and that given how long it has taken the agency, which I might add, really every time they make a tentative decision, is plagued by comments and delay, et cetera, I think we could make faster work for them by looking at some of those chemicals. So it's not, I don't think I have a disagreement at all in concept. I think the question on the table for us as we move forward for Tosca reauthorization is where are those conversations taking place, and let's keep an eye on how can we really make the system work. What would be the best solution to make the system work?
Now, Dr. Adams, I know in your testimony you said that a hard and fast PBT criteria would ignore scientific nuances like how a chemical or metal reacts in a particular environment or based upon climate or hydrology and other factors. So you would not want to just see a list to be banned by Congress, I'm assuming.
Well, I think there's a few chemicals. If you consider the POPs Treaty or the POPs Convention, for example, you will see some substances in there that are identified as being extremely hazardous and not to be traded in commerce.
So there's some things we could easily...
There are a few things out there that are kind of no-brainers, if you will, okay? And why not? I mean, and many of them are PCBs. They're not manufactured anymore, so it's an easy one. But
Right.
there are some others that could be an easy choice. But by and large, I think we want to consider the uses and we want to consider the risk of substances.
Right. Could you give me a couple of examples that there would be universal agreement on?
Well, if you look at many of the chlorinated pesticides that were used in the 60s and 70s, so that's lindane, alden, methoxychlor, DDT, DDE, so a number of those kinds of compounds are recognized internationally as being unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me just ask one other question that maybe someone could respond to. We've heard a lot of discussion today about implementation legislation in order to abide by some of these treaties. Could someone just give me a quick synopsis of what we're talking about there? Mr. Jones, you want to do that, or Dr. Thompson?
I could give you maybe some brief highlights, I think, of what is needed. I think in particular there's a number of provisions in the agreements that call for parties to do specific things. Under the Stockholm Convention, for example, we would have difficulties preventing the manufacture or production of chemicals for export and use in other countries. There's a number of other provisions that are related to both export controls and import controls for the different agreements that current domestic authorities don't really cover. And finally, there's some waste-related provisions to prevent the reuse and recycle of persistent organic pollutants that we would need some tidying up domestically to implement those obligations.
Okay. How many PBTs have actually been banned under Tosca since its inception? Have any?
Probably the most noteworthy one was actually banned by the statute, which was PCB, statute itself in 1976. I'm sorry, the most notable one is the PCBs were banned by the statute.
Yeah.
The agency has only taken 5 other sort of major regulatory bans since the statute was implemented, and I'm not sure if any of them are PBTs.
Okay. Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. Sarbanes for an additional 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just thinking about the different standards by which one could judge our efforts to limit some of these toxic chemicals and their use and our exposure to them and so forth. And there's all kinds of standards. I mean, there's the legal standard that would be used in a tort case, for example. There's the standard that the agency sets, which can sometimes interfere with or enhance the legal standard or be used to protect or create a higher legal standard. I guess there's an industry burden standard that operates in our thinking, but the one that I'm thinking about the most is what I would just call the kind of member of public consumer common sense standard. There's a lot of situations in which these other standards I mentioned, from the standpoint of the consumer, if they're more aggressive, they're seen as unreasonable. In other words, consumers will say, well, you know, that's going a little bit too far. But in this context, it's hard for me to imagine that a member of the public, understanding some of the risks that are involved here, would not want to adopt the most aggressive standard relative to all these others that was available. And I imagine people looking back on a hearing like this or on a reauthorization of Tosca that doesn't take the step of identifying obviously dangerous chemicals out of the gate and putting in place a rapid action strategy. I imagine the reaction of the public would be to say, you know, excuse me, what didn't you understand? What more did you need to know to take aggressive steps to address this problem? So going forward, I'm going to be pretty strong on the notion that we need to get out of the gate quickly with respect to those chemicals, that category of chemicals where we have a lot of knowledge at our fingertips. My question was this. Describe what you think will happen, and it sounds like it may already have begun, when our standards fall further and further behind the standards that are being imposed other places. Do we become a dumping ground? I mean, what that gap has got to produce some significant and harmful consequences to it. And if anybody would like to speak to that, I'd welcome it. Yes, Dr. Greer.
Yeah, I think there's three things that you see, and we've actually already seen all three of them. The first is that we could become a dumping ground. We used to worry about when the United States took action on a chemical that was unsafe, that maybe that chemical would wind up in the third world, in the developing world, and that would be, you know, something that we would feel morally responsible for because we had decided it wasn't safe enough for us, but it could go to Africa or someplace where the government was not up to speed on that. Well, now we face the real prospect that Europe will ban certain things from products, and they'll be okay here in the United States because Europe is ahead of our system, and that we, the United States of America, could become a dumping ground for things that are not safe enough for Europe. The other two things that you'll see, I think, and have already seen, is that states will start to take action where they have problems, either because they have hotspots of problems in certain rivers or in certain communities, or because their citizens are particularly upset and sensitized to this. And we'll get the sort of patchwork regulation that is not really good for industry because different states have different systems and it all gets very, very confusing. And the third thing that you'll see, which I think we're already seeing, is what we call retail regulation, which is that some in the private sector will say, we don't want to sell this. This is what happened with BPA in plastic bottles, in baby bottles, where they didn't want to wait for the government to take action because their market was being threatened by the fact that customers didn't want BPA in their baby bottles. And so they took action without the government for their own purposes, for their own business purposes, so that they could say to their customers, we have our own systems in place to make things safe for you, and you can feel happy to come shop here and buy those things. And that is sort of random. It's a chemical of the week system that we think if we had a well-functioning government system, it could be more orderly, more systematic, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those are the three consequences that jump to my mind immediately, and I actually think we're seeing all three of them already because, of course, the system has been broken for some time now.
Thank you.
The chair, thanks, the gentleman. The chair want to just make sure that we are clear about our purposes and what we will, our continuing work, and the focus of our continuing work. This will be on reforming Tosca, not necessarily reauthorizing Tosca. We want to make sure that you're clear about that. We want to reform Tosca, and it means a lot, you know. If we don't have the right idea of what we're working on, then we might wind up someplace else, and we certainly can't afford to wind up someplace else. We need to reform Tosca. With that said, I want to again thank the witnesses for sacrificing your invaluable time with us. You've been very informative and very enlightening toward this committee and subcommittee, and I, for one, feel much more empowered and enlightened because of your comments and your answers to the questions. And I want to thank you again for being here with us. And that said, without objections, I would like to submit into the record supporting federal action on PBTs from the Safer Chemicals Healthier Families. They sent letters. The Environmental Working Group has sent letters. The National Council of Church sent letters. This Pesticide Action Network of North America, we've heard from them in the form of letters and other communications, and the American Public Health Association. It's already been ordered that the American Chemistry Council's letter be included, and we have a letter also from the National Petrochemical and Refiners Association. Lastly, the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Waxman, has an opening statement that we will also enter into the record without objection. So, without objection, so ordered that these and other associated matters be entered into the record. The chairman also would like to keep the record open for another 2 weeks, and will ask the witnesses if there are any members of the subcommittee who want to ask questions in writing, if they would get to you, and if you would, in a timely manner, as properly as you can, respond to those questions in writing. It would certainly be of enormous help to this subcommittee. Thank you very much, and the subcommittee now stands adjourned. All right, thank you. Okay. See you now. Praise God. Thank you. All right.
Until next time.
Yeah. Okay.
Jim, it's good to meet you.
Take care.
You should go catch sardines.
I'll have some comments to you guys tomorrow.
Oh, not to me. I've washed my hands. Well, you can CC me if you want to make sure they get to you.
Okay.
Other than that, not to me. Last week they could have done to me.
We'll see you on Monday then, right?
Yes. I'm Shella.
Hi. Oh, hi.
Yes. Nice to meet you. I thought you might be the
Yes,
that was on the phone yesterday. Excuse me.
So, baptism by fire, right?
I guess so, yeah. Not bad for my 4th day on the job. Interesting, at least. Though this has been a fun transition.
Yeah.
Where I work in interior, it can get pretty busy sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
I'm in the policy office there, but I usually don't end up over on the hill.
Hey, wait a minute.
Yeah, they'll be printing some more. If not, I'd be surprised. Susan. Yeah. See if I have a card for you. Thank you. Yeah. Nice meeting you.
Take care.
Shella. Nice to meet you. I just started with their office on Monday on a rotation, so very recent.
Good luck.
Thank you.
That's how we got to know. I'm going to grab one.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
See ya.
I'm doing good.
So the meet and greet got rescheduled to 2. What's that? The meet and greet got rescheduled to 2.